Okay, so welcome everybody. Welcome to this session of the Teachers PD Lunchbox Series, Smart Tips for Online Teaching. And today's topic is about how students learn, using a theory called constructivism, and we'll be looking at the constructivist approach and implications on the role for you as teachers and for your students. If you've just joined us, welcome. So if you can put your answer to that chat, to that poll, if you've just started. And Teresa, would you like to give our welcome?
Apologies, I was just sending a private message to someone in the chat box to say about the mic. Welcome to today's session, and as always we'd like to acknowledge that we're conducting our meeting on many different lands today, for which our traditional owners have been custodians for many centuries, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and future. And really pleased to see a good turnout here today. I know that it will people will come on progressively, and we'll follow our usual process where I will keep an eye on the chat box and respond to you as I can. I hope you enjoyed today's. We thought, well, some of you already know a bit about learning theory. Some may not, and so this might be a way of dipping your toe in. For others, it might be a way of remembering what you've already learnt in the past, but also contributing to the discussion and the learnings for others, and finding a way of applying that in our online and mixed mode learning environment. So welcome.
Thank you, Teresa, and a great introduction there for the session, which will help you to understand how people learn so you can help your students to learn. That's the main reason why we want to know how people learn, is that we can then be better equipped to help our students to learn. We're going to also look at the differences between deep and surface approaches to learning, and you may very well have some thoughts on this from your own experience, but it's pretty common with teachers in vet as well as academics in higher education to kind of at some stages be frustrated that students are not taking the learning deep enough, that they skim over the top. So we're going to look at those two different approaches and how why they're both important, and how you can assist your students to move from those surface to more deeper approaches when you need them to do, and also that you can design an effective online learning environment. If you are in a course where you're still doing a lot of face-to-face teaching, so Moodle is mainly the online component, then you'll be able to apply everything we do today to that face-to-face environment, as well as if you're running a 100% online learning environment. This series, for those of you who haven't joined us before in this series, the aim is to explore topics around online teaching that will help you to work smarter rather than working harder. And working smarter there is defined as doing what matters most. We know everyone here works hard, so it's getting that focus on the bit in the middle between doing what matters most and working harder. And the approach that we're taking in this particular series is to focus on the pedagogy, the reasons why we do something rather than technology. So technology is clearly important when you're working in and teaching in an online environment. It offers, a whole lot of affordances for things that you sometimes, can't even do in a face-to-face environment. But we're focused here on getting the reasons why, the teaching reasons why you do something, and then learn the technology later. So whilst we refer to technology, we don't go into how to use the technology. The main focus is on the craft of teaching and designing for learning and working smart to respond to the changing needs of your profession as a teacher and this changing environment that students find themselves in as well. If you attended the last session last month, then you would recognise this slide where we began the conversation last session about this shift that is taking place within education not just in higher education, in fact, right across the board, but of course our focus is on higher education, and the vet sector particularly. So, you know, you will have seen this shift from not just moving from a traditional classroom style environment, but to an online environment, but that we're shifting. As teachers, we're being asked to shift from a focus of how we teach, so the focus being centred on us and how we go about teaching our students, to a focus that's more around the student-centred or learner-centred, which is about, well, how do students learn, and then our role becomes a facilitator of learning rather than as an instructor or a facilitator of knowledge delivery. So there are two approaches in the learning theories, in the traditions of learning theory. One is called as objectivism. Objectivism contends that knowledge exists independently of the learner, and therefore the process of learning involves coming to know that which already exists. It relies on teaching via direct instruction to facilitate the acquisition of knowledge and skills. Generally, in this theory, this learner doesn't need to provide any interpretation or any contextualization. They don't need to necessarily determine that what they're learning has meaning. We see, you know, traditional ways that this is done is through the memory, through drill and practice. People who come from this paradigm, teachers who come from this paradigm, are more likely to believe that a unit of study must present an existing body of knowledge to be learnt, such as facts, formulas, terminologies, principles, theories, and so on, and that it's their role to control what and how students learn. Many of the traditional approaches to learning and teaching have been based on directivism, direct instruction, for example, and also if you have gone more broadly or choose to go more broadly into, or sort of dive deeper, should I say, into some learning theories, then you'll come across behaviouralism and constructivism. They all fit within this objectivism approach to teaching. The other approach that we're going to focus on today is constructivism, and it asserts that knowledge and meaning is constructed in the learner's mind from their own experience rather than being transmitted to learner and teacher. So constructivist learning environments are about engaging students in activities to apply content. In most general senses, that means that you as the teacher, as we discussed last month, become this guide on the side, where you're using a lot of active techniques, helping students with real problem solving, collaboration, experiments, inquiry-based learning, discussions, and so on, to create the knowledge, to create more knowledge in their own minds and their own beings. And that reflection, talking about what they're doing and understanding, talking about what they're doing and how their understanding is changing, is an important part of that process. Constructivism also places quite a lot of focus on socially constructed knowledge. So not just that the knowledge is constructed individually within a person's own being, but also that we socially construct knowledge from interactions and experiences with other people and the world at large. Constructivism also considers that meaning is important, that if students don't have, or learners don't have, a sense of meaning in what they're learning, then they're not particularly, likely to engage, and that meaning emerges from practice or activity around the skill or knowledge, from discussion and reflection and so on. So for those of you who did the poll, it looks like everyone has placed themselves there in constructivism. Yay. That's good. So I will end the polling. Thank you to everyone who did that. Are there any notes in the chat, Teresa, on what we've said so far?
No, just so we've got Frank has talked about constructive alignment, BIGS, and Neville's done bachelor training. No, this, and then I've just put in a few other, you know, we've already said that there's some others that people might want to learn more about. These are just, we're just presenting something that's really applicable and can be useful today. And in case that whets your appetite and you want something else, I've just put a few others in there that you might be interested in because they sound cool, but they're also very relevant to what we do. They're things that we can apply. So
absolutely. And you know, you're talking there about you know, some things that really drill down into constructivism and social constructivism. And like I've done in every other one of these sessions, you'll find in the PowerPoint when you download it from Totara, you know, once it's put up there, that I've put links off to a range of resources for you. In constructivism, the real goal is to create this rich learning environment. So therefore, the researchers recommend that we engage our learners in activities that are authentic. In other words, that they're based in the real world, based on the sort of practice that a student will experience in their discipline. Collaboration, as I mentioned, is key. The opportunity to engage multiple perspective is also important. So there's not this view that there's, you know, one solution necessarily or one viewpoint, but that part of learning is to engage with multiple viewpoints, multiple perspectives. Support students in setting their own goals and regulating their own learning, because one of the keys with constructivism, as was mentioned, is that students are expected to take some control over their own learning. That's a key part of the theory, and the key part of how students learn. That again, if they don't have a sense of meaning, if they're not, they don't have their own goals, and they can't self-regulate their own learning, then that's really going to impact their capacity to learn. And that encouraging learners to reflect on what and how they're learning is important in creating that rich learning environment. Constructivism and vocational education, I just thought I'd mention here, particularly for people who perhaps haven't had experience as a vet teacher with looking at learning theories or pedagogy at all. I just wanted to mention that even as far back as 1998, constructivism was seen as being important in the vet sector. These are references from a Australian woman who wrote quite a large report about applying constructivism in vocational and education, career education, Bettina Lankard-Brown. And here's just a few of the things that she mentions, and I'm not going to read them out because I know people reading out on a screen is not always a fun thing. But so I just, as you're reading there, be interested if anyone wants to put in the chat if there's any thing there that sort of stands out for you or that you'd like to discuss a little bit further.
Susie, is it all right if I just make a little comment there?
Of course.
Some of you will know, you know, when we look at unpacking our training packages and look at developing our courses and our curriculum and also our assessment, we think about the called dimensions of competency. We look at how things are applied. We look at how people manage their skills, and you know, there's a whole suite of different ways that people might apply a piece of knowledge. And I think that's what you can see is so critical about understanding this constructivist perspective, is that it's not just about here's the knowledge and you know, we can tip this into your head. It's very, very relevant for these this kind of teaching that you guys do, where you're teaching people to go out into a workplace and work in a specific industry to understand that this is the kind of environment that you work in, this is how you work in that area, this is the kind of job you do, but you also are managing these other, you know, a number of different things at the one time, and this is the way you communicate in that workplace. So you can see why constructivist is so applicable to particularly post-compulsory education, which VET is.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent perspectives there, Teresa, and I think very much relevant to everyone who has joined us. Does anyone want to respond to what Teresa said or what is on the screen?
Just mentioning there, it's Frank here, in regards to the dimensions of competence. I haven't seen them pop up in that user's guide for standards for RTOs for some time. And what I saw fall off the radar was the final one of those dimensions of competence. There was task skills, task management skills, contingency management, job role and environment skills, but the last one, transfer to other contexts, which is probably becoming more and more relevant as our technology change. Point you've got there in that paragraph.
Yeah, that's that transferable skills, because that was really critical when that was brought in, and there was a big deal made about those dimensions of competence. But as you say, you know, they disappeared. I would think, though, you know, how things have a way of reappearing. I think it's still something that we might see reappear with a greater focus in the future. So perhaps that's something we look at a little bit more down the track as well. You know, when we delve into some more topics about learning and teaching, and particularly in VET, that would be relevant. So that's great that you still remember those. I don't feel like a dinosaur now.
Well, and your point, Frank, about transferability will come up a bit later on in this session when we talk about deep and surface learning, because it is a really key element to that deeper kind of learning. 4 attributes, or the 4 C's of, so in constructivism, you know, there's also some reference there to the kinds of attributes you want to bring into your online environment. All learning activities are relatable and relevant to the learner. So this again is just like in the last slide, and as we spoke about last session, this importance of it being authentic, of it being tied to something that the students will be doing in their discipline, will be doing in the real world, and that they can connect with the subject matter on some level in regards to, you know, that context, even if they've never worked in it before, but they're given that capacity to make those connections. Construction, so the first one is context, second one is construction, that they're able to take what they already know, what they've already done in the past, and build the new knowledge into that. So they can tie whatever is the new information, the new subject matter, to past experience, previous knowledge that they already have, as well as linking it to real life situations that they are currently facing or will face in their vocational profession in the future. Collaboration, which I've already mentioned, is key to the constructivist principles. So in collaboration, this is not just about working with peers, but it's also about them being able to apply their own thoughts and opinions whilst they're collaborating, and to participate in opportunities to come to their own conclusions with the group and on their own, and again to loop that back to their own context to bring that meaning in. And conversation, and again I think we've talked about this in the previous session about when we looked at discussions and the role of discussions in particularly the online environment and how we can do that. But the 4th attribute of the constructivist online education is conversation, that students are regularly involved in discourse and dialogue with their peers and with yourselves as teachers, that they're able to do self-reflection and turn that reflection, not just doing self-reflection in their mind, but actually writing that down and sharing that. So they're getting the opportunity to absorb new information, to apply it or transfer it to real life vocational context, and to continuously be deepening their understanding in the subject matter, in the context in which they're learning. Sorry, my voice is kind of going a bit. Constructivist teaching approaches, again, not dissimilar to things we've heard before. Last month when I focused more on that learner-centered environment that you'll be creating. So group collaboration projects, inquiry or problem-based learning, reflective learning, peer-assisted learning, and discussions. And I want to focus particularly on the top three, just to give you an idea about what that might look like in a unit, and perhaps spark some ideas in your own environment. So if we look at the collaborative learning, where students are working together to construct knowledge, a task that you might have students do is compile a manual or a glossary of useful terms or concepts related to the unit, or even a guide to a major unit concept. So this is where students get together and they will put all that information into an online environment, such as a Moodle wiki, or they could do it in a Google Docs or a SharePoint Teams site. Any kind of environment where you've got the collaborative opportunity for students to co-create that material. You could then add in a jigsaw technique, so taking that to another level, and certainly if you've got quite a bit of content to get through that you need students to master, then you can using the jigsaw technique is basically where you give individual students a topic, and they become the expert, and then they share that information and teach their others. So you might have 20 students, and you divide your topics up so that 2 or 3 of those become experts on one topic, and instead of trying to get 30 different 20 different students mastering every single topic, you can focus that down a bit. And your role then becomes to facilitate that. So you're facilitating whether they're accurate, you're facilitating where they find that information. You may even have that contained with, for example, within a workbook or a resource that you're already referring to them, but they have to pull out that, for example, that glossary of useful terms. So you don't give them a glossary, they've got a workbook or a series of resources, and then you say, okay, so come up with a glossary of useful terms. You may define what they need to be depending on the level. If it's a certificate 3, then that would be a different process than if you were working with diploma, where at a diploma level you might say to the students, right, go through and create a glossary of useful terms without saying what those words need to be, and then you guide them on that process. In terms of inquiry or problem-based learning, and again, particularly if you've got here students in regional areas or fully online students, taking your hospitality students, for example, on a virtual field trip to a kitchen of a 5-star hotel, it's probably going to be a bit challenging, very expensive. But you can use a site like virtualfieldtrips.edu.au, which is a site that has been put together by a number of universities and TAFEs and stakeholders that have gone to hotels around the country and overseas, and they've got interviews with key managers from different areas within the hotels. They've got being a virtual field trip there, so they've got video and they've got images and maps and all sorts of resources. So you could take your students there, and then you could either get them to do an online assignment or get them to do a face-to-face assignment, depending on the context of your blended or online course. Another thing that you could do is create a web quest. Does anyone know what a web quest is? Has anyone used a web quest?
In primary teaching, I've used it before.
Yeah, so, yep.
So, where you're providing a lot of clues and things like, well, the one I did anyway, was providing clues, not the actual links to websites or anything like that, but clues to get students to go and actually be active in investigating and chasing up information and compiling it online.
Absolutely, Justin. That's exactly right. So a web quest is basically a structured web research activity. And you can create your own. You may also find that someone's already created web quests for you. There's quite a lot on the, available on the internet. And again, in the PowerPoint, I've provided you with some links. There's an introductory guide and some resources there from opencolleges.edu.au. But it's a structured activity where students go and research the particular topic or subject matter, and then what you can do is have them bring that knowledge back and put it into a wiki or into a Google Docs and start to then make sense of it. One of the things about a web quest, it isn't just about the research, it's then about what they do with that information that they find. But as you can see with both of these activities so far, the students are in control of their learning. You're facilitating it, you have to design the activity, but then the students are going out and finding that information, engaging with it, creating understanding, demonstrating understanding, and so on. Forth. If you're wanting some ways of developing your reflective learners, then journal activities are always good, and you can use the blog in Moodle, you can use ePortfolios, Mahara offers opportunities for journaling. Oops, sorry. And you can also have students do a video diary, so record it in Zoom or any other, they can even record it on their mobile phone, where you don't have to just have that journaling activity be done by writing. They could, do that through a video diary quite easily. So there's just some different activities that are active, constructivist learning activities, and how you might use different technology to do them. Whatever it is that you're going to design as in terms of your activities in that constructivist environment, it's important that you pose problems of relevance to students. And emerging relevance here means they may not know yet that it's relevant to them. But it's not just about you saying this is relevant to you, this is relevant to you, but you're demonstrating how it's relevant to them. And you want to structure your learning around the primary concepts, and those primary concepts linking back to your intended learning outcomes, back to the requirements in the unit of competency, the performance criteria, and so on. That you seek and value the student's point of view in the activity, that you adapt the curriculum or your learning and teaching to address what the students will, what they bring forth as their own theories or suppositions about a particular concept, and that you lastly assess the student learning informative ways. So not just through the summative or the final the final assessment, but in formative assessment, which is where your students are learning and you're assessing them along the way, building on their knowledge as they go, so that at the point at which they do take that summative assessment, or the different evidences that you're going to be gathering from them, they're well placed to to succeed. And from the constructivist perspective, formative assessments are actually more valuable to the learner. But of course, that's a challenge in our environments where, so often the focus is on the summative assessment, the evidence that's collected. One of the common misunderstandings with constructivism and active learning environments, I think generally, is that we should never tell students anything directly. As it says there, this is confusing a theory of pedagogy, i.e. teaching, with a theory of knowing. In constructivism, any way that the students learn, anything that you present to the students, any way that you might teach them, even direct instruction, say via a lecture, can still involve attempts to construct new knowledge. It then becomes about how that's facilitated, not just that there's this passive listening, but once they've done the listening, what are they doing with that information? How are they processing? What goals are they applying that to? Another misunderstanding is that if a learning task is active, it will result in high quality student achievement. It may result in high quality student engagement, but learning, as we know, sometimes doesn't follow engagement. Particularly, there's an argument about using active learning techniques, videos, and all sorts of things which can be entertainment but don't necessarily equal learning. So it's really important that we get out of our active learning high quality student achievement, the results that they need to do. And that's where having an understanding of the distinction between deep approaches and surface approaches to learning becomes useful. So has anyone come across this concept before of surface learning versus deep learning, and how have you used it if you have? So no, okay. Well, just to give you a bit of an understanding then of surface learning. So surface learning is where the student or the process of learning is focused on the ideas, the content, the knowledge, the information. You'll know surface learners, they appear to be focused on passing the assessment instead of, or rather than, as well as learning. And we have those right across education, there's probably even some in the latter areas of primary school, and certainly right through high school and into higher education, where it's like, what do I, and you can typically hear it is, what do I need to know to pass? What do I need to know to, to do the exam? What do I need to know to complete the essay? Now, there isn't anything wrong with surface learning, as we're going to hear in a moment. It's actually really important. The challenge is when people stay at that level of surface learning, when they just memorize for an assessment and aren't then actively involved in taking that deeper, such as actively searching for meaning or relating that knowledge to something they've done previously or to something that is connected to their discipline, to the profession that they're moving into, that they're not engaging with critical thinking to determine whether or not there's a logic of argument to that information. And again, we can see this when students do that research online, and that's one of the elements of that web quest, is having students engage with that information that they find online to be able to examine it for logic and right reasoning. Whereas just taking something from Wikipedia and sticking it into your assignment, or cutting and pasting it out of a workbook, is all surface learning. When they're then required to take that deeper, extend or relate or transfer that knowledge, then it becomes meaningful to them. When students take a deep approach, they develop understanding, create meaning, make ideas of their own, which results in higher long-term retention of the new knowledge or the skill. One of the key distinctions with the deep versus the surface approach is the intention behind the activity. So if there's an intention to understand and create meaning from what is being learned, then that will be deep learning. If there's just a intention to reproduce, then that's going to be a surface approach. So whether or not something is a deep or a surface approach can depend on the intention. So even memorizing could be part of a deep approach, where it is, well, first of all, I have to learn, I have to memorize my times table, or I have to memorize the different aspects of the anatomy, because until I know those things, that they can just slip into my mind when I'm doing something deeper, you're not going to succeed. So you need to have both there, but working in a cycle from surface to deep. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. No one's jumping on there. So how can you encourage a deep approach? Sorry, did someone who wanted to jump in and say something?
That was me just saying yes. People are saying yes, it makes sense.
So ways to encourage a deep approach. If you'd like to take yourself off mute, if there's any there that you'd like to make a comment on.
I can comment because I always do anyway. So I think, so the fourth one along, encourage students to make connections with or challenge what they already know. I think that's a good principle for anything that we do, and it does kind of fit with some of the other sessions we've had where you talked about chunking the content and structuring the content in a way that learning builds upon what they already know. I think that's a really good principle, and perhaps people are doing that without consciously doing it, but maybe if we do keep that uppermost, when we're preparing, we're thinking about, well, what order do we do things? Particularly when you think about a workplace task, you do this first, and then you need to know how to do that before you can do this, and then you need to know how to do this next thing before you can take the final step. So yeah, I thought maybe that might be something that's very relevant for particularly in vocational, but also in other kinds of career-centred education.
Absolutely. And, when you're in the classroom or the workshop working with students, and you're, I was in a simulation lab the other day, for example, with a teacher, and, as the simulation is unfolding, encouraging students to make those connections comes quite naturally. But when you're going into the online environment, as we learned in last month's session, you have to design for those. You have to be thoughtful about, well, how am I going to get students to make connections with what they already know, or how am I going to challenge what they already know, where, perhaps there's in an area, for example, I used to do some work with ethics teachers. They're always challenging people with what they already know. I also worked with an academic who was teaching a Foundation Indigenous Studies course, and by nature that content challenged people. So in her case, it was, how do I, challenge them and also make sure that doesn't create or trigger in students trauma. So, in the online environment, you have to design for that. In a classroom or a workshop, you might be able to, do that through your, your teacher presence there and then. Ongoing feedback seemed to be important to encourage deep learning. Absolutely, Tobias. Feedback is really key. And as you say, the ongoing feedback loops, which speaks to that concept of the formative assessment. So the assessment by learning.
Can I just ask how many people use formative assessment is that something that we do much of, or who uses formative assessment? Yeah, Frank does. If you're not sure what formative assessment is, happy for us. Yeah, we've got a few people that. So if that might be something, and if you're not sure what it is, we're happy to have a bit more of a discussion about that with you at some point. Just give us a call. I think that's really important in terms of, as we're talking about the feedback, and also the other one on there that might be really relevant for what we're all doing is the making that, we talk about making things authentic. I think from what I've seen, many of our teachers work really hard to find authentic experiences for their students to learn from or to do their assessment in. So I just wanted to congratulate. That's something I've noticed in CPU. You work really hard to make sure that we do have those kind of authentic experiences and refer back to, you know, real life, what's happening in the workplace kinds of issues. So that's, you can see when you're doing that, that's a really important approach to encourage that deep learning.
And I would say, you know, absolutely, that those of you who aren't quite sure about formative assessment are probably doing it more than you think, because it's those opportunities where students are able to get feedback from you on their progress, and that what their progress is in is taking them towards that final summative assessment or the evidence that you're collecting. So it's when you give students that opportunity to express how they're learning, and then you give them feedback, and then they, you know, take that on to the next point. Before we move on, I'd just like to mention this one here, which is the green on the bottom line, about helping students to perceive and set clear goals and standards for learning in the unit. So, you know, many of you may do learning agreements with your students. If you don't, there's definitely things worth considering, because what you're doing is, from the beginning, from the get-go, you're saying to students, well, what are you going to get out of this, and what are you going to put in? Because unless you know what it is that you want to achieve, and I just want to pass this subject, miss, it's not the right answer. You know, what is it that you are, you know, you're really doing this subject for? What is it that you want to learn in this course? Not just what do you want to pass, but what do you want to learn? And then how will you know when you've got there? Those kinds of goal setting principles don't have to be, you know, done in a you know, you spend a lot of time on them, but it is getting students to create those agreements with themselves, and agreements with you, and agreements with other people. I'd just like to show you this video, and then have you break out into your yes. So Teresa's just written something there about formative assessment isn't included in the assessment results grade, but certainly great for preparing students for summative assessment to review their learning process. Yes. So we need both of the approaches of deep and surface learning. Professor John Hattie, who's from the University of Melbourne, he's a director of the Melbourne Educational Research Institute at the University of Melbourne. He's done a lot of research into this area of deep and surface learning, and he says that around 90% of the time, the focus remains on surface knowledge and learning, both in terms of the student remaining there, as well as the educators, even in active learning activities, not helping the students to go deeper. So as you watch this video, I'd like you to consider your own online learning environments, particularly whether you've got a fully online course or whether you're in a blended learning, but also if you want to take this to the context of your classroom, you know, absolutely fine. It goes for about 7 minutes. So it is a longer video, but I hope you find that it's quite worthwhile, and I'd encourage you to make some notes on the ideas that he presents, so then we'll go straight into the discussion room afterwards, and you can have some chats on with each other on what you think of his ideas. So excuse me, I'll just stop sharing. Forgot to tick the little box that says share computer sound. We want to make sure that happens. Okay.
It's a very important distinction between surface and deep learning. Surface learning is very much about the ideas, the content, the knowledge and the information. And the deep learning is when you relate or extend or transfer that knowledge. And certainly in many schools and many systems, there is both those two parts, the content and how we relate and extend that content, are really critical. Look, the differences between surface and deep learning are really important. On the one hand, I don't want to imply that it's a straight, very sharp distinction between the two of them. On the other hand, you can see them as a graduation from having an idea, from having many ideas, and that's the surface part, and then relating those ideas, and then extending the ideas. This is all based on a model developed by two Australians back in the 1970s, Kevin Collis and John Biggs, and they called this their solo taxonomy, and it very much relates to the complexity of learning. And probably the most important thing is that you need both. Certainly, to have relationships between ideas, you have to have ideas. And this is partly why we can see them as a bit of a continuum. Have an idea, have many ideas, then you relate them and then you extend them. Now the issue is that as you start relating and extending ideas, they start to form a new idea. And then you're back to the surface part of the cycle again. So it's a continuing cycle. But certainly the argument is that in any form of learning, any form of teaching, it's really important to know where the student is at, and the aim is to have +1, go to the next level as much as you can. As you're starting to learn something for the first time, the appropriateness of surface learning comes to the fore. Like if you've never played golf, you've never driven a car, you've never played canasta, then I would expect in the first few lessons that 90% plus of the lesson would probably be about surface learning. In fact, driving a car is a good example, whereas as a parent, we teach our kid about defensive driving and getting a sense of where they are in the car and making sure that they have anticipation. And at that moment, all they care about is where the brake is. They want to know the surface level. And so great teaching knows what to focus on. But after a while, surely it's important to move the proportion of surface from 90%, say, and start to relate ideas to make it to the deep side of the equation. Here's the problem. When we do observations of classrooms, when we do analysis of student work, and we ask the question, what skills typically does a student need to do work in our schools? 90% plus, all they need is surface level knowledge. Surely that's not right. Now notice what I didn't say. I didn't say what the teachers think, because teachers always think it's deep learning. In fact, one of the big mistakes we make is we go to deep learning sometimes far too quickly. And so it's a really important distinction to make as to find out where the student is in that cycle of surface to deep. And obviously the other one I want to add in there is, and then as part of the deep learning, you want them to transfer to similar and to different tasks. Look, when should learning shift from surface to deep? I'm not bad at searching literature. I'm struggling to find any article ever written that addresses that problem. And I think that's a really major issue for us. Now, I don't want to imply that there was actually a moment when suddenly you should go from surface to deep. It's a continuum. In fact, learning is very much a staccato. But certainly we should be aware as instructors about where the students are on that complexity of learning cycle from surface to deep. And certainly at some point we should be saying to the students, stop learning more and start relating them. See, my answer to this particular question is to look at the work you ask the student to do. Look at the assessment, look at the particular task and say which part of it is surface and which is deep. In fact, in all my own work, I usually have at least 2 questions for every concept. A surface question and a deep question. So it's very clear to the student what I'm asking for, and it's very clear to me. Students are very smart. They don't do what you ask them to do. They don't do what you tell them to do. They do what they think you think is valuable. And what is valuable is usually your assessments. So if you work backwards and construct your assignments, construct your tasks, and as I say, the easiest thing is split them. Have a surface part and a deep part. Make it plain to the student, that's what it is. Don't trick them. We need to know that you know the content. We need to know how you're going to relate the content. Then marking and scoring is a lot easier because you can have a surface and a deep component. And that's certainly what we see as the big distinction. Despite 150 years of study, it's very hard to find evidence of how you teach transfer. But we would certainly argue from the work we've been doing in the Science of Learning Centre, it is possible. And here's a very simple example. Let's say I teach you something, and then I want you to apply it to a new situation. Like you learn something in history about Australian history, and I want you to apply it now to American history. Or I give you a maths problem, and I want you to try another maths problem. Before you do the next problem, if you stop and ask the question, what are the similarities and differences between these 2 contexts, then transfer can happen. The problem is many students learn something, then go to the next problem, start solving it using the same strategy and it doesn't work. So I do think there's a lot we can learn about near and far transfer that's very important. In this learning cycle of moving from surface to deep, there is another kind of moderator, and that is when you first are exposed to something. I'm going to introduce you to surge today, or to distillation. I'm going to introduce you to a new period of Queensland history. Then when you're first exposed, the strategies that work are quite different from the strategies at the next part when I ask you to consolidate. Remember, we're humans of little brains. Most of us can only remember 5 plus or minus 2 things at any one time. And so in many senses we have to overlearn a lot of the surface knowledge. And this is why, in mathematics for example, once you get the notion that 9 lots of 6 are 54, memorize it, overlearn it. So you're not sitting there saying when someone asks you to do a problem, well, what's 9 times 6? And those students who learn how to overlearn, really, they can then move to the next phase. Like when we did the work with Nolda Purdy many years ago looking at Asian students in Australia, particularly at university level, they spent a lot of time overlearning the surface level knowledge so they could then spend their time doing the relating and extending. So there is a lot to be asked about the strategies that matter at the different stages of surface and deep, and I think it's really important that we include transfer in the equation.
Any comments on that while I set you into rooms?
I noticed the transfer came up a lot. So that seems to be still important. Frank and I were talking about the transfer skills that we used to focus on a lot in vet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms now, and I encourage you to think about what you can take from today's session, particularly from that video on surface and deep, but maybe from any of the other ideas I presented. Now, I'm just going to do this for 5 minutes because we're getting close to time.
Sorry, Susie, I had to leave. I've got.
Oh, you have to leave.
On the door.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
That's okay.
Okay. Everyone's back.
Yep, we're
Yes,
back.
we're back. Well, I'm sorry that I couldn't give you more time, and we've certainly probably packed quite a bit in the last 55 odd minutes. If you want to stay on a bit after and continue some conversation with myself or Teresa for 5 minutes, feel free. I'd just like to start to wrap up. And as I say, I'm sorry I can't debrief from your experience there. But in summary, in this session, we focused on teachers understanding how your students learn so that you can help them to learn, and focused on constructivism as a theory that asserts that knowledge and meaning is constructed in the learner's mind rather than being transmitted from the teacher to the educator. We looked at 4 C's of constructivist online education. We looked at some examples of how to create constructivist teaching activities and the distinction between deep and surface approaches to learning. And I hope you found that one particularly useful to assist you in creating learning environments that your students can achieve the learning outcomes that you desire for them. Next month, Justin, would you like to, if you're still here, would you like to say a word about the next session that we've got, as
Sure.
you'll be co-hosting it?
No worries. Yeah, look, so I'm Justin. I'm a vet learning designer with Learning and Teaching Services. And in the next event next month, Nick Lawler and myself will be showcasing a number of Moodle sites we've developed or are currently developing. And we've made use of Moodle in some diverse ways. So the idea is to demonstrate and inspire teachers, hopefully, how they can use Moodle and build a picture of what that might look like for themselves. And Nick's also going to be demonstrating the new H5P set of learning objects which are available for Moodle in the near future. So that will be pretty interesting as well and valuable for teachers.
Thank you, Justin. Teresa, did you want to say anything there?
Yes, well, I was just typing it, but I will say it. I wanted to reinforce that we were concerned that perhaps people thought if they weren't a QC that this wouldn't be relevant for them, the Moodle unit showcase. We wanted to reinforce that actually it would be valuable for anybody, because as we move forward and have more and more of our resources on Moodle, and we develop even better ways of doing that, I think everybody will have a little bit more ownership of what they do and certainly have a bit more input. So I think it would be great for you to come along and see what's possible, spread the word. I know that we get a lot of interest in what can the educational developers do for VET. I think this is an opportunity to have a look at the way that they can use their skills to work with you to produce something that's really useful and that applies some of what you're learning about being a great teacher in an online environment. There's so much there to help you, and we'd like to share it. So I would just, I'll send out lots of emails, but please, if you know anybody who just thinks, oh, maybe it's not for me, please just tell them, yes, come along, let's go and have a look. Let's go and have a look at what they're doing and get some ideas. Okay, that's the best way we can work together to make this Moodle gig the best we can make it.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Justin. And I would add my encouragement to that. I've seen some of the sites that Nick and Justin and Sam, when she was working with the Trades College, put together, and there's some really inspiring things there, from little things to complete reshapes or redesigns of units that you definitely get some inspiration and value from. If you've got any questions from anything that arises today in any of this series, please let me know. You can claim, just a reminder, you can claim currency, of course, for attending or reviewing the recording session. And overall, thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime today to come and attend this session. I do hope that you have found some inspiration again. I'd encourage you to give your feedback to us online, which you can find on the Totara site, and which again we'll send out in the links. If there's something that isn't working for you, something else you'd like to see, then please put that in to either an email to Teresa, myself, or use the survey on Totara for anonymity. Thank you again very much. I hope that you found some smart tips here today, and we look forward to seeing you on the 3rd. Bye for now. As I say, if anyone wants to stay on for a couple of minutes and ask a question, you're more than welcome. Goodbye.
Thanks, Izzy. Thanks, Teresa.
See you. Thanks, everybody.